At 2:14 a.m., the entire ICU fell into a silence, so heavy it felt like the building itself had stopped breathing, and billionaire William Harrington stood frozen at the edge of his son's hospital bed as every monitor flatlined into a single, unbroken tone that no one in the room wanted to accept. Doctors moved quickly, but without urgency now. Their eyes lowered, their voices softer, as if speaking louder might make the truth more permanent. "We're losing him," one of them said, not as a warning anymore, but as a confirmation of something already decided. 8-year-old Ethan Harrington lay still under the pale hospital lights, his small hand slipping slightly against the white sheets that suddenly looked too large for him, while machines that once promised control now offered nothing but silence. Outside the glass doors, the world of power, money, and influence that William commanded every day meant nothing here, in a room where everything had already slipped beyond his reach. He pressed a hand against the glass, not touching his son, not allowed inside the final seconds of system that had already given up. Somewhere down the hallway, a coffee cup clinked softly against the counter, and Olivia Carter, a night shift waitress in the hospital cafe, paused mid-step as she noticed the sudden change in energy through the corridor window. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in this wing, not near this room, but something about the stillness made her stop. She watched the doctors exchange glances, saw the subtle shift in their posture, the way experience had taught them when to try and when to accept. But Olivia didn't move away. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in panic, but in recognition of something subtle hidden beneath the surface of the monitor's data. She had seen numbers like that before, patterns that didn't belong to failure, but to misalignment, to error disguised as inevitability. Inside the room, William's voice broke for the first time, low and sharp, demanding another attempt, another solution, anything that could reverse what was unfolding in front of him. No one answered him. No one could, except Olivia, who slowly stepped closer to the glass, her reflection merging with the sterile light of the ICU, watching a detail everyone else had missed. A rhythm hidden beneath the flatline pattern, too small for fear to notice, but too precise to ignore. And in that moment, as the most powerful man in the building faced the collapse of everything he could control, a waitress who was never meant to be part of this room quietly reached for the door that separated observation from action, unaware that what she was about to do would not only challenge the doctors inside, but rewrite everything William Harrington believed about loss, failure, and the limits of impossible. The moment Olivia Carter reached the door, separating the observation corridor from the intensive care unit, everything inside her told her to stop, but the rhythm she had noticed through the glass would not leave her mind. The air on the other side felt colder, more controlled, filled with the quiet precision of machines that measured life in numbers rather than meaning. A nurse glanced up as Olivia stepped inside, her presence immediately out of place among sterile uniforms and focused urgency. "Miss, this is a restricted area," the nurse said quickly, but Olivia did not retreat. Her eyes were already on the monitor above the small patient bed where Ethan Harrington lay, the same 8-year-old boy she had seen moments ago through the glass. The waveform on the screen told a story everyone else had already accepted, but Olivia's attention locked onto a subtle inconsistency in the medication flow chart displayed on the adjacent panel. It was not obvious at first glance, not something that would alarm or rush staff, but to her it was as clear as a misaligned heartbeat in a quiet room. Behind her, the sound of approaching footsteps grew heavier, and William Harrington entered with a controlled but strained expression, his presence instantly changing the atmosphere of the room. He looked at his son, then at the doctors, then finally at Olivia, who still stood near the monitor without speaking. "Who allowed her in here?" one of the doctors asked, irritation breaking through exhaustion, but William raised a hand slightly, not because he trusted her, but because he had nothing left to lose by listening. Olivia finally spoke, her voice calm but firm, pointing not at the boy, but at the screen displaying the medication infusion rate. "This is not matching the metabolic response," she said simply. The room fell into a brief silence, the kind that happens when certainty is interrupted by something unexpected. A senior physician stepped forward, narrowing his eyes at the data. "That is within protocol," he replied, but Olivia shook her head slightly, as if she had seen this pattern before in a context they were not considering. She did not argue emotionally, only observationally, pointing out a discrepancy in timing that suggested the body was reacting slower than expected to the dosage being administered. William's jaw tightened as he looked between her and the medical team. "Are you telling me you know better than my doctors?" he asked, not with anger, but with a fragile edge of hope trying not to exist. Olivia hesitated for the first time, aware of what she was stepping into, but she did not step back. "I'm telling you something is not aligning," she said quietly. A nurse began to object, but the attending physician raised a hand, suddenly uncertain enough to reconsider the data in front of him. The room shifted, not toward chaos, but toward doubt, and in that fragile space between certainty and possibility, William Harrington found himself watching a woman in a cafeteria uniform become the only person in the room not afraid to question what everyone else had already accepted. And as the monitors continued their steady rhythm, something in Olivia's expression suggested she was not finished seeing what others had missed. The silence inside the intensive care unit did not break immediately after Olivia Carter spoke, but it changed shape, becoming heavier, more uncertain, as if every person in the room was suddenly reevaluating what they thought they knew. The senior physician stepped closer to the monitor again, his eyes narrowing as he compared the medication infusion data with the patient's response curve, and for the first time, a trace of hesitation replaced his professional certainty. William Harrington remained still near his son's bedside, his attention divided between the fragile breathing of the boy and the calm presence of the waitress who had not stepped back even once. Olivia did not move either, but her focus shifted slightly toward the medication pump, her eyes tracking timing intervals that most people would consider irrelevant under pressure. "If the response delay is longer than expected," she said quietly, not addressing anyone in particular, "then the dosage timing is compounding instead of stabilizing the system." A nurse immediately responded that all protocols had been followed, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The attending physician leaned in closer to the screen, recalculating values in real time, his expression tightening as he noticed a discrepancy that had been too small to trigger alarms, but too consistent to ignore. William's voice broke the tension again, lower this time, controlled but strained. "Is she correct?" he asked, not demanding reassurance, but demanding truth. No one answered immediately, and that silence became more revealing than words. Olivia finally turned slightly toward him, not with confidence of authority, but with the calm of someone who had seen similar patterns before and recognized the cost of overlooking them. "The system is reacting as if the dosage is standard, but his body is not processing it at that rate," she said. "If that mismatch continues, stability will not return naturally." The phrase "stability will not return" hung in the air long enough for every professional in the room to feel its weight. One of the younger doctors adjusted the settings slightly, as if testing a theory rather than correcting an error, while the senior physician stepped back from the monitor for a moment, his jaw tight with conflicted judgment. William looked at his son again, his expression shifting from controlled authority to something more vulnerable, something closer to fear than anger. For the first time, he was not looking for control. He was looking for certainty. Olivia remained still, but her attention was now fully inside the clinical rhythm of the room, noticing not just numbers, but patterns, timing, and the subtle lag between input and response that others had dismissed as normal fluctuation. "There is also a secondary factor," she added quietly after a pause, drawing attention back to her without raising her voice. "The hydration balance is off by a small margin, but enough to affect absorption." That statement finally broke the division in the room, forcing the staff to recheck readings they had already verified twice. The senior physician exhaled slowly, not in agreement yet, but in reluctant reconsideration. William stepped closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the data himself now, no longer trusting only the titles of those around him. "If this is wrong," he said carefully, "how did it go unnoticed?" No one answered again, because the answer was not simple. Olivia did not speak further, but she did not leave either. She simply watched as the team began adjusting parameters, not fully convinced, but no longer fully dismissive. And in that fragile shift from certainty to reconsideration, the room that had been defined by loss began to hold something unfamiliar. Not hope yet, but the possibility that something had been missed, and that the person who noticed it first was the one no one had expected to matter at all. The adjustment to the infusion settings did not create an immediate change, but the atmosphere inside the intensive care unit shifted in a way that everyone could feel, but no one could fully explain. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but now each beep carried a different kind of attention, as if the room itself had started listening more carefully. Olivia Carter remained near the edge of the medical workstation, her eyes moving between the display panels and the subtle fluctuations in the waveform on the main screen. The senior physician, now visibly more cautious, rechecked the recalibrated values and compared them against the patient's response trends, his earlier confidence replaced with a measured uncertainty. William Harrington stood close enough to see his son's face clearly now, his hand resting on the railing of the bed, no longer commanding the room, but quietly enduring it. "There is a slight improvement in oxygen stability," one of the nurses said after a few moments, her voice careful, as if afraid to overstate anything. The number was small, but in a room like this, even small changes carried weight. Olivia noticed it too, but her expression did not relax. Instead, her focus narrowed further, as if the partial correction had revealed a deeper layer of imbalance beneath it. She stepped closer to the secondary monitor and studied the hydration and electrolyte balance again, her gaze tracing timing sequences that most people would overlook once the primary issue seemed resolved. "This adjustment is only compensating for the surface effect," she said quietly after a moment, drawing attention back to her without raising her voice. The senior physician turned toward her, this time not with dismissal, but with guarded attention. "Explain what you are seeing," he said, his tone less defensive than before. Olivia pointed at a sequence of delayed absorption indicators, showing how the system was reacting inconsistently across different measurement intervals. "The body is not responding uniformly," she continued. "Even if we stabilize one variable, another one is lagging behind. That delay creates instability cycles." William listened without interrupting, his eyes shifting between Olivia and the medical team, trying to translate the technical language into something that could answer the only question he cared about. "Will his son be okay?" The senior physician adjusted his stance, leaning in again, this time more methodical, rechecking each value with slower precision. "If your interpretation is correct," he said carefully, "then we've been treating the response and not the cause." Olivia nodded slightly, not in satisfaction, but in confirmation. "That is what the pattern suggests," she replied. A brief silence followed, not tense now, but focused as the team began running a second layer of diagnostic recalculations. William's grip tightened slightly on the bed railing, not from fear alone anymore, but from the unfamiliar experience of relying on someone he would normally never have noticed. The idea unsettled him more than he expected. A waitress standing in a hospital wing identifying what an entire medical team had missed. The monitors continued to stabilize slowly, but Olivia's attention shifted again, this time toward a subtle inconsistency in the patient's neurological response data. It was not part of the original concern, but did not match the expected recovery trajectory either. She hesitated for the first time since entering the room, then spoke again. "There may be another layer we are not accounting for," she said quietly. The senior physician looked at her, then at the data, then back again, no longer dismissing her input, but no longer fully ready to accept it either. William finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "If there is something else, we need to know now." Olivia met his gaze briefly, then returned to the monitor. "It is not about another intervention," she said. "It is about understanding what triggered the instability in the first place." And as those words settled into the room, the entire perspective began to shift again, not toward conclusion, but toward a deeper question that no one had fully asked yet, while the small but fragile signs of improvement continued to flicker across the screen like a reminder that the situation was not over, only changing. The quiet stability that had begun to form inside the intensive care unit did not last long enough for anyone to feel relieved, because Olivia Carter's final statement had changed the direction of everyone's thinking from fixing symptoms to questioning origin. The senior physician stood closer to the main diagnostic panel now, reviewing the full medical history of Ethan Harrington with a level of attention that had not been present before, while William Harrington remained at his son's bedside, watching every movement with a controlled silence that carried more weight than any demand he had made earlier. Olivia did not speak immediately again, but her focus had shifted from monitoring current values to examining historical data entries, tracing patterns backward through the last 24 hours of treatment. The room felt different now, not because the danger had passed, but because the assumption of understanding had been removed. "We need to review the initial trigger event," Olivia said finally, her voice steady but more deliberate than before. One of the junior doctors responded that all intake records had been verified, but the senior physician did not interrupt this time. Instead, he began scrolling through the early admission charts himself, as if reconsidering the foundation of everything they had built since the moment the boy arrived. William turned slightly toward the team. "What trigger are you referring to?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a request for clarity he could no longer find alone. Olivia stepped closer to the secondary screen and highlighted a sequence from the earliest recorded vitals. "The instability did not begin at the point of collapse," she said. "It began earlier, during the initial response phase after admission." The senior physician paused, then leaned in closer, reviewing medication timestamps and procedural notes. A subtle inconsistency appeared in the timing between administration and recorded metabolic response, small enough that it would normally be dismissed as variation, but consistent enough to suggest a pattern. "There is a delay in absorption reaction," Olivia continued, "but it does not align with the expected physiological profile for this condition." The room fell into a deeper focus, as if everyone had unconsciously leaned forward into the same question. William's expression tightened slightly, not from anger, but from the realization that something foundational might have been overlooked. "Are you suggesting the treatment itself initiated the instability?" he asked carefully. Olivia did not answer immediately. She reviewed the data once more, then spoke with caution. "I'm suggesting that the system responded to something before treatment even stabilized the condition," she said. The senior physician exhaled slowly, then turned to another monitor displaying allergy and sensitivity records. A nurse quietly pointed out that no known allergies had been documented, but Olivia's attention shifted to a less obvious section of the file, one that recorded prior experimental procedures during a routine evaluation weeks earlier. This entry was marked non-significant, she said, indicating a small notation buried within the history. But it introduced a variable that was never fully tested under stress conditions. William stepped closer to the screen for the first time, reading the same line she was pointing to. The realization did not come as a dramatic moment, but as a slow unfolding of something that had always been there, but never questioned. The senior physician finally spoke again, his tone lower now. "If that variable is interacting with the current medication pathway, it would explain the delayed and inconsistent response." Olivia nodded once, not as confirmation of certainty, but as alignment with possibility. The room shifted again, not toward resolution, but toward responsibility. William looked at his son, then back at the team, and for the first time since entering the hospital, his voice carried something closer to cooperation than command. "Then we correct everything," he said quietly. And in that moment, the focus of the entire intensive care unit moved from reacting to searching, as if the true challenge was no longer saving time, but understanding exactly where time had first begun to slip away. The decision to re-examine every earlier assumption transformed the intensive care unit from a place of reaction into a place of investigation, where every line of data was now treated as a potential clue rather than a fixed truth. Olivia Carter remained near the diagnostic station, Her attention no longer focused only on Ethan Harrington's current condition, but extending backward through the entire sequence of medical interventions recorded since his arrival. The senior physician, now fully engaged in reevaluating the case, brought up comparative charts from previous patients with similar symptoms, but none of them matched the subtle irregularities present in Ethan's response pattern. William Harrington stood slightly away from the monitors now, his presence quieter, as if he understood that control in this moment came not from authority, but from patience. If this variable was introduced before treatment began, the senior physician said slowly, then we may be observing a chain reaction rather than a direct condition. Olivia nodded once, confirming without overstatement. That is consistent with delayed system response behavior, she replied. The room grew more focused as additional staff began cross-referencing lab results, medication logs, and procedural notes. A pattern emerged gradually, not dramatic or sudden, but precise enough to shift the direction of interpretation. A junior doctor pointed out a minor discrepancy in timing between initial evaluation and the first administered stabilization procedure, something that would normally be dismissed as administrative delay. Olivia immediately recognized its significance. Even a small delay in this context changes how the system processes subsequent inputs, she said calmly. William stepped closer again, his eyes moving between the documentation and his son, trying to connect technical explanation with the reality in front of him. Are you saying this entire situation may have been influenced before we even began treatment? He asked. Olivia did not answer immediately, choosing her words carefully. I'm saying the system may have been responding to an unaccounted factor from the start, she said. The senior physician leaned back slightly, reviewing the sequence again, now seeing it through a different lens. If that is accurate, he said quietly, then our current approach has been stabilizing effects rather than addressing origin. The implications settled over the room, not as panic, but as recalibration. William exhaled slowly, absorbing the reality that the crisis was not a single point of failure, but a layered sequence of overlooked details. Olivia continued reviewing the historical records, her focus narrowing on one specific procedural note that had been marked routine but now appeared contextually significant. This entry indicates a prior diagnostic adjustment during intake, she said, pointing to the screen. It was minor, but it altered baseline sensitivity parameters. The senior physician examined it closely, then acknowledged the possibility that even a small deviation at that stage could have influenced all subsequent readings. A quiet pause followed as the team collectively understood that they were no longer simply treating a condition, but reconstructing a timeline of cause and effect. William finally spoke again, his tone no longer uncertain, but measured. If this is where it began, he said, then we need to correct it from the beginning. Olivia did not respond with agreement or disagreement. Instead, she simply continued analyzing, as if the next step was not about confirming what had gone wrong, but ensuring that every hidden layer was brought into view before any further decision was made. And in that sustained silence of focused examination, the intensive care unit became less about urgency and more about precision, where every second of understanding mattered as much as every second of life itself. The intensive care unit had entered a state of controlled precision, where every movement was deliberate and every observation carried the weight of consequence. As the medical team worked through the reconstructed timeline with a level of attention that had not existed earlier, Olivia Carter remained positioned near the diagnostic interface, her focus steady as she tracked the corrected sequence of events from the initial admission through each subsequent adjustment. The senior physician stood beside her now, no longer resisting her input, but actively testing it against the available data, while William Harrington watched from just behind the glass line of the patient area, his silence carrying a different quality than before, less like authority and more like acceptance of uncertainty. If we treat the origin point as this procedural adjustment, the senior physician said carefully, then the downstream instability becomes mathematically consistent. Olivia nodded slightly, her attention fixed on the layered charts displayed across the monitor. Yes, she replied, but only if we account for how the system adapted after the initial deviation. A junior doctor entered additional recalibrated data into the system, and the updated projections showed a gradual stabilization curve, though not yet strong enough to confirm recovery. The room collectively watched as the numbers shifted in real time, each change small but meaningful. William stepped closer again, his gaze alternating between his son and the data that now defined his condition in technical terms rather than emotional ones. What happens if this correction is incomplete? He asked, his voice steady but restrained. Olivia did not look away from the screen when she answered. Then the system will continue to compensate, but never fully reset, she said. The senior physician reviewed the updated model and acknowledged the possibility with a slow nod, his earlier skepticism replaced by cautious validation. We are now working with a cascade response rather than a single-point condition, he said, more to himself than to the room. Olivia continued to analyze the residual fluctuations, identifying a secondary pattern that had only become visible after the primary correction was applied. There is still a feedback delay, she said quietly. It is smaller now, but it is preventing full stabilization. One of the nurses adjusted a parameter slightly under instruction, and the monitor responded with a subtle but noticeable improvement in consistency. The change did not bring relief, but it did shift the emotional pressure in the room from urgency to focused persistence. William exhaled slowly, his attention now fully aligned with the process rather than the outcome, at least for the moment. How close are we to full stability? He asked. The senior physician hesitated before responding, choosing accuracy over reassurance. We are close enough to see progress, but not yet close enough to declare resolution, he said. Olivia remained silent for a brief moment, studying the final layer of irregularity still present in the system. Then she spoke again, her tone calm but precise. If the remaining delay is addressed through micro-adjustments rather than major intervention, the system should complete its correction cycle. The team moved carefully, applying minimal refinements while monitoring each response in real time. The monitor stabilized further, the waveform becoming more consistent, and the variability that had defined the crisis began to diminish into controlled rhythm. William's posture softened slightly, not in relief, but in recognition, that the situation was no longer collapsing. The senior physician stepped back from the console, finally allowing himself a moment to acknowledge the shift. We are approaching equilibrium, he said quietly. Olivia did not respond immediately, her attention still on the final data points as they settled into alignment. And as the intensive care unit entered its first sustained moment of stability since the crisis began, the realization spread through the room that the outcome had not been determined by authority or expectation, but by the careful identification of what others had overlooked and by the quiet presence of someone who had seen the pattern long before anyone else was willing to believe it. The intensive care unit no longer felt like a place on the edge of collapse, but rather a controlled environment where fragile stability was being carefully maintained through continuous adjustments and disciplined attention. The monitor above Ethan Harrington's bed displayed a steady rhythm that had not existed an hour earlier, each waveform now aligning with a pattern that suggested the system was no longer reacting unpredictably. Olivia Carter remained near the diagnostic station, her posture unchanged, her focus still locked on the subtle residual variations that continued to appear at the margins of the data. The senior physician stood beside her, no longer in opposition, but in quiet collaboration, reviewing the final stabilization curves with a level of concentration that reflected both relief and caution. William Harrington stepped closer to his son's bedside, his hand resting lightly on the rail, watching the small but consistent signs of improvement, as if confirming that reality had not shifted again without warning. The stabilization trend is holding, the senior physician said after a long pause, his voice measured, careful not to overstate what was still delicate. Olivia did not respond immediately, her eyes scanning the final correction layer where the last inconsistencies had appeared earlier. The system has entered a self-correcting phase, she said quietly. but it still requires monitoring until the feedback cycle fully completes. A nurse documented the updated readings, noting the sustained improvement in oxygen levels and neurological responsiveness. The numbers were no longer fluctuating unpredictably, but settling into a consistent range that matched expected recovery patterns. William looked between the monitors and his son, his expression no longer tense with urgency, but still carrying the weight of everything that had occurred. "So he is stable now?" he asked, his voice lower than before. The senior physician hesitated for a moment before answering, choosing precision over reassurance. "He is stable under current conditions," he said. Olivia finally turned slightly toward William, her expression calm but focused. "The critical phase has passed," she added, "but full recovery will depend on how his system continues to respond over the next several hours." The room, once filled with rapid decisions and overlapping commands, had now shifted into structured observation. Each member of the medical team moved with quieter confidence, no longer reacting to crisis, but confirming resolution step by step. William remained by the bedside, no longer seeking immediate answers, but watching for continuity in the signs that now defined survival. Olivia stepped back from the monitor slightly, allowing the team to maintain oversight, but her attention did not fully leave the patient. There was still a subtle awareness in her expression, as if she understood that stabilization was not an endpoint but a transition. The senior physician reviewed the final diagnostic summary and exhaled slowly. "We did not just treat a condition," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We corrected a sequence we did not initially understand." Olivia did not comment on the statement, but her silence carried agreement without emphasis. William finally spoke again after a long pause, his voice steady but changed. "Then it was not just medicine that saved him," he said. No one responded immediately, because the answer was already visible in the data, in the adjustments, and in the sequence of decisions that had unfolded. And as the intensive care unit settled into a sustained rhythm of stability, the presence of Olivia Carter remained quietly integrated into the moment, not as someone who had taken control, but as someone who had recognized what others had missed, changing the outcome not through authority, but through perception that arrived before certainty. The intensive care unit remained quiet in a way that no longer carried tension, but instead carried the steady rhythm of controlled recovery, where every monitor displayed consistency rather than uncertainty, and every sound in the room felt measured rather than urgent. Ethan Harrington lay peacefully under soft hospital lighting, his breathing now stable, his vital signs aligned in patterns that no longer required constant correction. William Harrington stood beside his son for a long time without speaking, his hand resting lightly on the bed rail, as if he was afraid that any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile stability that had finally returned. The senior physician reviewed the final stabilization report on the screen and then slowly closed the file, acknowledging that the critical phase had passed without needing to announce it aloud. Olivia Carter remained near the diagnostic station, but her presence now felt quieter, no longer central to the action, yet still present in a way that could not be ignored by anyone who understood what had just occurred. William finally turned toward her, his expression no longer guarded or analytical, but deeply reflective, as if trying to reconcile everything he had witnessed with everything he had previously believed. "You were right from the beginning," he said quietly, not as a statement of authority, but as an admission of understanding that had taken time to form. Olivia did not respond immediately, her attention briefly returning to the final data stabilization curve, which now showed full consistency across all monitored systems. "It was not about being right," she said after a moment, her voice calm and steady. "It was about noticing what others had already seen but did not connect." The senior physician stepped forward slightly, his tone respectful now in a way it had not been earlier. "Your analysis changed the outcome of this case," he said. Olivia simply nodded, not acknowledging praise, but acknowledging process. William looked at his son again, then back at Olivia, and for a brief moment the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it ever had before. "I do not know how to repay something like this," he said honestly. Olivia shook her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "You do not need to," she replied. "The result is what matters." The room remained still for a few more moments, as if no one wanted to disrupt the final balance that had been achieved. The medical team continued their quiet documentation, recording the conclusion of a case that had moved from crisis to stability through a sequence of corrections no one had fully anticipated at the beginning. William finally stepped back from the bedside, his posture no longer rigid, but reflective, as if something fundamental had shifted in how he understood control, expertise, and assumption. As Olivia prepared to leave the monitoring area, she paused briefly at the doorway, glancing once more toward the stabilized readings, not with satisfaction, but with quiet acceptance that the situation had resolved as it should. William noticed her pause and spoke one last time. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice sincere but restrained, "you will have it." Olivia looked back at him briefly, then gave a small, polite nod without attachment. "Take care of him," she said simply, before turning away. The intensive care unit returned fully to its normal rhythm, but something subtle had changed within it, not in the equipment or the procedures, but in the awareness of those who had been present. And as Olivia Carter walked away from the room, unnoticed by most and remembered clearly by a few, the quiet truth remained that in a place defined by precision and expertise, it had been observation, patience, and attention to detail that ultimately shaped the outcome, leaving behind a moment that no one inside that room would interpret the same way again. The silence inside the intensive care unit was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, something that made every heartbeat on the monitor feel like a decision rather than a signal. At 2:14 a.m., Ethan Harrington lay motionless under white hospital lighting that reflected off stainless steel equipment, while billionaire William Harrington stood at the edge of the bed, his authority reduced to nothing more than a man waiting for a system he no longer controlled. Across the room, Olivia Carter remained still, her presence quiet but precise, her attention locked on a sequence of data that others had already stopped trusting too early. The senior physician reviewed the final emergency readings, his expression no longer sharp with confidence, but softened by uncertainty that had been forced into clarity by necessity. Every monitor in the room continued its steady rhythm, but nothing about the situation felt steady. Olivia's eyes moved across the diagnostic interface again, tracing a pattern that had first appeared as a flaw, then as a possibility, and now as the only explanation that still held together under scrutiny. William finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of command. "Tell me exactly what is happening," he said, not as an order, but as a request from someone who had exhausted every form of control. Olivia did not look away from the screen when she answered. "The system is no longer reacting to a single condition," she said. "It is responding to a chain of overlooked variables that began before treatment even started." The senior physician turned slightly toward her, no longer dismissing her perspective, but testing it against his own understanding. "If that is true," he said carefully, "then the entire progression was misaligned from the beginning." Olivia nodded once, not in agreement, but in confirmation of structure. "That is consistent with what the data shows," she replied. The room fell into a controlled silence, the kind that happens when people are no longer arguing with each other, but with what they previously believed was certain. William stepped closer to his son, his hand resting near the bed rail, his eyes fixed on the subtle rise and fall that now represented fragile stability rather than crisis. Around them, the medical team worked with slower precision, recalibrating values, rechecking sequences, and adjusting parameters that had once been assumed correct. Olivia continued analyzing the residual irregularities, her focus narrowing as she identified a final inconsistency that had not fully resolved. "There is still a delayed feedback loop," she said quietly. "It is smaller now, but prevents complete normalization." The senior physician leaned in again, confirming the last adjustments with careful attention. "Then we correct it incrementally," he said. Minutes passed in structured silence as the final modifications were applied. The monitor responded not with dramatic change, but with gradual consistency, as if the system itself was finally aligning with the reality it had been resisting. William watched without speaking, his expression no longer searching for miracle, but for confirmation that stability could hold beyond the moment. Then, slowly, the waveform stabilized into a consistent pattern that no longer suggested emergency intervention was required. The senior physician stepped back slightly, exhaling in quiet acknowledgement. "We are stable," he said at last, not as celebration, but as confirmation of completion. Olivia remained focused for a few more seconds, ensuring the consistency was sustained, then finally stepped back from the diagnostic panel. William turned toward her, his expression no longer guarded by status or expectation, but shaped by recognition. "I did not believe someone in your position could see what we missed," he said honestly. Olivia met his gaze briefly, calm and unshaken. "It was not about position," she replied. "It was about noticing what others stopped looking at." The words lingered in the air longer than expected, not because they were complex, but because they were simple in a way that reframed everything that had happened. The senior physician closed the final report, acknowledging the resolution of the critical phase, while the nurses documented the recovery progression with quiet efficiency. William looked at his son again, and for the first time since the crisis began, he allowed himself to step back from the edge of control. "I do not know how to repay this," he said again, but softer now, as if the phrase itself had changed meaning. Olivia shook her head slightly. "You do not need to," she said. "Just make sure the system that failed to see this once does not fail the same way again." There was no accusation in her voice, only clarity. William nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what had been revealed not just about medicine, but about assumption itself. As the medical team continued final monitoring procedures, the room gradually returned to normal operational rhythm, but something within it had shifted permanently. Ethan's condition remained stable, the monitors confirming consistency across all measured systems. The crisis that had defined the night was no longer active, but its impact remained present in the awareness of everyone who had been part of it. Olivia paused once more before leaving the room, glancing back at the stabilized readings, not as a conclusion, but as a reminder of how close the outcome had been to something entirely different. William noticed her pause and spoke one final time. "If there is ever anything you need," he said, "you will have it." Olivia acknowledged the statement with a simple nod, then turned away without hesitation. The intensive care unit continued its quiet work, but those who remained understood that what had happened there was not only about a patient, but about perception, oversight, and the hidden structures that determine outcomes long before decisions are made. And as Olivia Carter walked out of the room, unnoticed by most and remembered clearly by those who understood what they had witnessed, the final truth settled into place, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty. Sometimes the difference between failure and recovery is not authority, expertise, or power, but the ability to see what others have already stopped seeing long before it becomes too late.